The low, marshy delta, where the great rivers of the Rhine, Meuse and Scheldt meet the North Sea, has, for millennia, presented a singular paradox for human settlement. The very forces that brought life to the region, the fertile alluvial soils and extensive river networks, also posed an existential threat through constant flooding. Early populations were forced to contend not with invading armies as their primary adversary, but with the relentless advance of the sea and the unpredictable course of swollen rivers. This environmental pressure was the dominant factor in shaping the earliest patterns of human habitation. The first inhabitants, likely Celtic and Germanic tribes, chose elevated sand dunes, known as turpen, for their settlements. These man-made mounds, gradually built up over generations, offered the only secure ground in an otherwise fluid and perilous landscape. Their construction required immense communal effort, suggesting a social organization centered on collective survival and cooperation. These communities, bound by the shared necessity of flood defense, developed a culture of pragmatism and resilience. The complex river systems also dictated strategic and economic development. The Rhine served as a natural highway connecting the interior of the continent to the North Sea. It was a conduit for trade goods and a pathway for cultural exchange, but also an avenue for military invasion. The control of these river mouths became a central geopolitical concern, influencing the location of fortifications and the focus of early political power. The North Sea, far from a barrier, acted as a vital economic link. Early Frisian and Saxon tribes established extensive maritime trade networks that connected the region to Scandinavia and Britain, exchanging furs, amber, and salt for metals and luxury goods. This reliance on a maritime economy fostered a decentralized social structure where powerful seafaring chiefs controlled trade rather than extensive land-based territories. The lack of defensible terrain, such as mountains or deep forests, meant that early defense was less about fixed strongholds and more about managing the aquatic landscape. The shifting tides and seasonal floods could be used as a form of natural fortification, creating impassable barriers for invading land armies. However, this defense was dual-edged, as it also complicated internal communication and the ability to muster a unified force. Just a quick announcement. If you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The environment itself was the primary shaper of political and social organization, forcing communities to adapt or perish. The political fragmentation that would characterize the Netherlands for centuries had its roots in this very landscape. The river deltas and marshes created natural divisions between groups, and the small-scale nature of early landholdings discouraged the formation of large, centralized kingdoms in favor of a patchwork of local powers. The relationship between land and water was not merely a physical reality, but the fundamental determinant of the region's historical trajectory, long before the arrival of outside influences. The constant struggle for survival against nature's forces instilled a unique character in the people of the Low Countries, a pragmatic and innovative spirit that would define their future achievements. The Roman presence in the Low Countries was both a military and a cultural phenomenon that fundamentally altered the region's development. By the 1st century BCE, the Rhine had been established as the northern frontier of the Roman Empire, a boundary known as the Limes Germanicus. This riverine frontier was not a simple line, but a complex system of forts, watchtowers, and military roads designed to control movement and trade. Archaeological excavations along the Rhine's delta have uncovered numerous military camps, such as those at Velsen and Nijmegen, revealing a highly organized and permanent imperial presence. These fortifications served not only to defend against Germanic incursions, but also to project Roman power into the unconquered territories beyond the river. The military infrastructure, from disciplined legions to auxiliary units recruited from local tribes, introduced Roman methods of warfare, engineering, and logistics to a region previously defined by decentralized tribal conflict. The Roman military presence also served as a catalyst for economic and urban development. Roman forts evolved into bustling trading centers, attracting merchants and craftsmen from across the empire. The city of Nijmegen, for instance, developed from a military camp into a prominent administrative and commercial hub, a testament to the empire's capacity for urban planning and resource management. Roman engineers constructed a network of roads and bridges that facilitated trade and troop movements, integrating the region's scattered settlements into the broader imperial economy. This infrastructure, while initially serving military purposes, created a framework for future commercial prosperity. The introduction of Roman coinage, legal practices, and Latin as a language of administration further solidified the cultural influence of Rome, providing a common framework for commerce and governance. The relationship between the Roman authorities and the local population was complex, a blend of cooperation and subjugation. While some tribes were violently subdued, others were integrated into the Roman system as allies, or foederati. Frisian and Batavian tribes, in particular, provided highly valued cavalry units to the Roman army, gaining military experience and exposure to Roman culture in the process. The presence of Roman villas, with their sophisticated agricultural techniques and luxury goods, also influenced the local aristocracy, who adopted Roman dress, customs, and art. This cultural synthesis created a hybrid society where Roman and Germanic traditions coexisted, leaving an enduring legacy. This imperial chapter, though it eventually concluded with the retreat of the legions, had laid a foundation for governance, trade, and cultural identity that would persist for centuries. The experience of living under a single centralized authority, even a distant one, would serve as a crucial reference point for the fragmented kingdoms that followed. As Roman authority receded from the northern frontier during the late 4th century, a power vacuum emerged, allowing indigenous Germanic tribes to expand and consolidate their influence. Two groups, in particular, would shape the political and social landscape of the post-Roman Low Countries, the Frisians and the Saxons. The Frisians, a seafaring people whose territory stretched along the North Sea coast from the Rhine Delta to the Weser River, were the dominant force in the northern part of the region. Their society was highly decentralized, organized into independent chiefdoms and villages rather than a single unified kingdom. This social structure, rooted in a reliance on maritime trade and a culture of personal freedom, was distinct from the more hierarchical societies of other Germanic tribes. Frisian economic power was built on control of key trade goods, particularly salt, which was extracted from peat bogs and became a valuable commodity in the North Sea economy. Their trade networks extended far and wide, connecting them with Scandinavia and Britain, where Frisian merchants known as Kopang established a reputation for their commercial acumen. The Frisian language, closely related to Old English, provided a common form of communication that facilitated commerce and cultural exchange across the North Sea. To the east, the Saxons, a confederation of tribes from what is now northern Germany, began expanding westward into the lands vacated by the Romans. Unlike the Frisians, the Saxons were primarily a land-based people, with an economy centered on agriculture and livestock. Their society was organized around powerful warrior chiefs and a strong tradition of martial prowess. Their expansion was driven by a need for new agricultural lands and a desire to control strategic territories. The Saxon legal system, based on oral tradition and a reliance on trial by combat, was fundamentally different from the written Roman law that had briefly held sway in the region. Their pagan religious practices, centered on the worship of gods like Woden and Thor, also set them apart from the emerging Christian communities to the south. The initial relationship between the Frisians and Saxons was a mix of competition and intermittent conflict. They vied for control of trade routes and fertile lands, with clashes occurring along the borderlands of their territories. These conflicts, however, rarely escalated into full-scale wars, as both groups were more concerned with establishing their own dominance in the post-Roman chaos. Instead of a large, unified kingdom, the Low Countries became a complex mosaic of independent, and semi-independent tribal territories, each with its own customs, political structures, and economic base. This political fragmentation, a direct consequence of the Roman withdrawal, would persist for centuries. It was within this environment of decentralized power that the foundations for the future duchies and counties of the medieval Netherlands were laid, a process driven by the ambitions and rivalries of these two powerful Germanic peoples. The political landscape of the Low Countries, characterized by a fragmented mosaic of tribal territories, began to undergo a significant transformation with the expansion of the Frankish kingdom. The Frankish, a powerful Germanic confederation, had already established their dominance over much of Gaul, and their sights were set on the strategic lands of the Rhine Delta and the North Sea coast. Under the leadership of Clovis I, the Frankish kingdom systematically absorbed smaller, independent polities, often through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic alliances. The Frankish approach to expansion was more methodical than the chaotic movements of earlier tribes. Clovis's conversion to Nicene Christianity provided him with a crucial political advantage, earning him the support of the Gallo-Roman population and the established church, which viewed his rule as legitimate. This religious legitimacy allowed the Franks to integrate conquered territories and peoples more effectively than their pagan counterparts. The Frankish incorporation of the Low Countries was a gradual process that unfolded over several generations. The conquest of the Ripuarian Franks brought the Frankish border to the Rhine, placing them in direct contact with the Frisians and Saxons. The Merovingian kings, Clovis's successors, launched a series of campaigns to subdue these northern tribes and secure control of the lucrative North Sea trade routes. These were not singular, decisive battles, but prolonged military engagements that tested the endurance of both sides. The Frankish army, a well-organized force that combined heavy infantry with a small but effective cavalry, proved a formidable opponent for the more decentralized Frisian and Saxon warbands. Their superior siege warfare techniques and logistical capabilities allowed them to capture fortified settlements and maintain control over conquered territories. The incorporation of these new lands into the Frankish realm brought significant administrative and legal changes. The decentralized tribal customs of the Frisians and Saxons were gradually replaced by the more hierarchical Merovingian system. Frankish counts were appointed to govern newly acquired territories, imposing a new layer of authority that reported directly to the king. Frankish law codes, based on a mix of Germanic tradition and Roman administrative practices, were introduced, providing a more formal and structured legal framework. The Carolingian dynasty, which succeeded the Merovingians, completed this process of consolidation. Under Charlemagne, the Frankish Empire reached its zenith, and the Low Countries were fully integrated into a vast, centralized realm that stretched across a significant portion of Western Europe. Charlemagne's administrative reforms, including the establishment of a centralized chancery and the appointment of missi dominici to oversee local governance, ensured that the authority of the emperor extended to the most remote corners of his empire. This period of Frankish rule, while often violent, established a political unity that had been absent from the region since the fall of the Roman Empire, laying the groundwork for the future political and social development of the Low Countries. The expansion of Frankish political authority into the Low Countries created a fertile ground for the introduction of Christianity, fundamentally altering the spiritual and social fabric of the region. While some areas had been exposed to Christian influences during the late Roman period, large-scale conversion began in earnest during the 7th and 8th centuries through the work of Anglo-Saxon missionaries. These monks and bishops, sent from the flourishing Christian centres of Britain, were instrumental in spreading the faith beyond the administrative reach of the Frankish court. Their mission was not merely to baptize, but to establish a permanent ecclesiastical structure that would endure long after their initial work was done. The most prominent of these missionaries was Willibrord, an English monk who arrived in Frisia in the late 7th century. With the political backing of the Frankish mayor of the palace, Pippin of Herstal, Willibrord founded the first bishopric in the region at Utrecht. This strategic location, a former Roman fort, was a key religious and administrative centre. The establishment of the bishopric provided a central point from which Christian teachings could be disseminated, and a formal institution to oversee the new converts. The work of conversion was often slow and met with significant resistance from local pagan traditions. The Frisians and Saxons adhered to polytheistic beliefs centered on the worship of nature deities and ancestral spirits. The missionaries, however, persevered, often targeting the local aristocracy and tribal leaders, whose conversion would often lead to a ripple effect among their followers. The martyrdom of Saint Boniface, another Anglo-Saxon missionary, in Frisia in 754, illustrates the enduring tensions between the old pagan ways and the new Christian faith. Boniface, known as the Apostle of the Germans, was killed by a group of Frisian warriors, an event that became a powerful symbol of Christian sacrifice and resolve. Despite this setback, the process of Christianization continued, strengthened by the coercive power of the Frankish state. Charlemagne, in particular, used military force to compel the conversion of the Saxons, viewing Christianization as a necessary tool for political unification and control. The establishment of monasteries played a crucial long-term role in this process. Monastic houses, such as Echternach, founded by Willibrord in modern-day Luxembourg, became centers of learning, agriculture, and craft production. They served not only as spiritual retreats, but also as economic hubs, draining marshes, reclaiming land, and introducing new farming techniques to the local population. These monasteries also acted as repositories of knowledge, preserving Latin literature and theological texts at a time when much of Europe was experiencing a decline in literacy. The long-term impact of this religious transformation was profound. It provided a common cultural and ideological framework for the diverse peoples of the Low Countries, integrating them into a unified Christian Europe. The Church's hierarchical structure, with its bishops and abbots, provided a new source of authority that often competed with, and sometimes complemented, the secular power of the Frankish kings. This dual system of authority, religious and political, would define the governance of the Low Countries throughout the medieval period. The relative stability of the Carolingian period was shattered by the arrival of a new formidable threat from the north, the Vikings. Beginning in the late 8th century, Viking longships, with their shallow drafts, allowed them to navigate the rivers and estuaries of the Low Countries with unprecedented speed and efficiency. Their raids were not merely acts of piracy, but calculated military and economic operations. The coastal regions, with their nascent trading ports and undefended monasteries, were particularly vulnerable. The initial attacks were sporadic but became increasingly frequent and organized, with large fleets of longships carrying hundreds of warriors who systematically targeted and plundered key settlements. The wealth of the Frankish monasteries and towns, accumulated through agricultural surpluses and long-distance trade, proved an irresistible lure for the Norse raiders. Monasteries in particular were prime targets, as they contained not only valuable liturgical objects and gold, but also large stores of grain and other provisions. The burning of these religious and economic centres led to a significant disruption of the region's nascent ecclesiastical and administrative structures. The Frankish response to these incursions was largely ineffectual. The vastness of the Carolingian Empire made it difficult to mount a coordinated defence. The Frankish military, structured to fight land-based campaigns on its eastern borders, was ill-equipped to counter the hit-and-run tactics of the Vikings. Royal decrees and military levies were often too slow to respond to the sudden appearance of Viking fleets. Local counts and governors, lacking the authority and resources to raise armies on their own, could do little more than watch as their territories were plundered. The fragmentation of the Frankish Empire, following the death of Charlemagne, further exacerbated this problem, as local magnates became more focused on internal power struggles than on defending the empire's vulnerable coastal frontiers. The lack of a unified command structure allowed the Vikings to exploit internal rivalries, sometimes even allying with local leaders to gain a strategic advantage. This period of sustained Viking pressure, characterized by a series of devastating raids and ineffective counteroffensives, forced a profound change in the region's social and political dynamics. The The centralized authority of the Frankish kings was increasingly seen as incapable of providing security, leading local populations to turn to their own leaders for protection. This shift in loyalty would set the stage for the emergence of powerful local dynasties and the beginning of a new phase in the history of the Low Countries. The ineffectiveness of the Frankish imperial response forced local populations and their leaders to develop their own defensive strategies against the persistent Viking threat. Without a reliable central authority, military responsibility devolved to regional aristocrats who possessed the necessary resources and local knowledge to protect their lands. This period marked the beginning of a profound shift in power, as these warrior aristocrats transformed from imperial administrators into autonomous rulers. Their legitimacy was increasingly derived not from royal appointment, but from their ability to provide tangible security. The construction of fortified settlements, a practice that had declined since the Roman period, saw a resurgence. These fortifications were initially simple earthworks and palisades, designed to offer temporary refuge for the local populace and their livestock. They were often built at strategically defensible locations, such as river fords, islands, or elevated ground. The emergence of these local strongholds coincided with the development of more sophisticated military tactics. Unlike the Frankish legions, which were optimized for large-scale land battles, the local forces became adept at small-scale mobile defense. They employed ambushes, hit-and-run tactics, and detailed knowledge of the local terrain to harass Viking raiding parties and protect key trade routes. The reliance on mounted warriors also increased, as cavalry provided the speed necessary to confront the fast-moving Viking fleets. These local military leaders, commanding small retinues of professional soldiers, gradually established themselves as the dominant political force in their respective territories. The term count, once an imperial title, began to signify a hereditary ruler with full military and judicial authority over a specific region. The establishment of these powerful, often semi-independent, counts laid the foundation for the future political landscape of the Low Countries. The fortifications themselves evolved in both scale and complexity. Initially, temporary wooden structures were sufficient, but as the Viking threat became a permanent fixture of life, more robust and durable defenses were built. Stone castles, though still a rarity, began to appear in the 10th and 11th centuries, symbolizing the permanent consolidation of aristocratic power. These fortresses served as both military bases and administrative centers, from which the counts governed their expanding territories. The economic impact of these defensive measures was significant. The cost of maintaining a private army and constructing fortifications was immense, and local lords imposed taxes and tolls to finance these endeavors. This created a new economic reality where security was a commodity, and those who could provide it held sway. The period of Viking raids, therefore, acted as a crucible, forging a new political and military order in the Low Countries. It dismantled the old imperial structure, replacing it with a decentralized system of strong, self-reliant lordships that would become the cornerstone of medieval Dutch society. The dissolution of the Frankish Empire, a process formalized by the Treaty of Verdun in 843, had a profound and lasting impact on the political landscape of the Low Countries. This agreement, which divided the Carolingian territories among the grandsons of Charlemagne, marked the beginning of a long period of fragmentation. The western portion, known as West Francia, would eventually become France. The eastern portion, East Francia, would evolve into the Holy Roman Empire. The Middle Kingdom, Lotharingia, was a narrow, geographically complex strip of land that included a large portion of the Low Countries. This division was not based on existing ethnic or linguistic lines, but on dynastic convenience. As a result, the region was split between two larger political entities, a schism that created the seeds of future political instability. The Treaty of Verdun did more than simply draw new borders. It formally dismantled the unified administrative and military structure of the Carolingian state. The Low Countries, already struggling with the Viking threat, were now subject to the competing interests of rival monarchs. Lotharingia, in particular, became a political battleground, as both West and East Francia sought to assert control over its territories. This contest for power created a state of perpetual political flux and weakened the ability of any central authority to enforce its will. In this power vacuum, the local counts and dukes, who had been struggling to defend their lands against Viking raids, were now able to consolidate their power and become de facto rulers. They built their own castles, raised their own armies, and increasingly exercised full military and judicial authority without consulting a distant king. This decentralization of power was a direct consequence of the imperial breakup. The fragmentation that began with the Treaty of Verdun would define the political reality of the Low Countries for centuries. The region would not develop into a single unified kingdom. Instead, it would evolve as a collection of powerful, semi-independent lordships, including the counties of Flanders, Holland, and Hainaut, the duchies of Brabant and Guelders, and the Prince-Bishopric of Liège. These entities, while nominally part of a larger empire, operated with a high degree of autonomy. Their relationships with their distant overlords were often tenuous, marked by shifting alliances, rebellions, and intricate diplomatic maneuvering. The legacy of this initial schism was a complex and often conflicting web of allegiances that prevented the region from becoming a cohesive political unit. This political diversity, born from the imperial breakup, would both expose the Low Countries to constant internal strife and, paradoxically, foster a spirit of local independence and innovation that would eventually lead to their economic and cultural preeminence in later centuries. The Treaty of Verdun's fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire created a power vacuum that local aristocrats were quick to exploit, initiating a period of slow but deliberate consolidation. Two regions in particular, Holland and Flanders, would develop into the key political entities of the medieval Low Countries. This process was driven by a combination of strategic marriages, military conquests, and the astute management of their local resources. The Counts of Flanders, initially vassals of the French crown, began to systematically expand their territory and assert their autonomy. They leveraged their strategic position at the crossroads of European trade, using their influence over lucrative wool and textile markets to finance their military campaigns and build their political power. The countship's proximity to England and France forced its rulers to engage in a complex and often shifting diplomatic dance, playing the great powers against each other to preserve their independence. Their military strength, built upon a core of professional knights and urban militias, allowed them to both defend their borders and project power into neighbouring territories. Similarly, the Counts of Holland, who controlled the lands around the mouth of the Rhine and Meuse rivers, began a methodical process of consolidating their power. Their initial authority was limited, but they skillfully expanded their influence over smaller lordships and reclaimed land from the sea through dike building and drainage projects. This land reclamation, a labour-intensive and expensive endeavour, provided the counts with a new source of wealth and a loyal population of farmers who depended on their protection. The Counts of Holland also engaged in strategic marriages with the families of powerful neighbouring lords, expanding their influence and forging alliances that strengthened their position. Their control over the river systems and access to the North Sea made them crucial intermediaries in the trade between the Holy Roman Empire and England, a position they exploited to accumulate wealth and political leverage. The rise of these two powerful counties fundamentally altered the political geography of the Low Countries. They became models for other local lordships, demonstrating that a strong, centralized authority could provide both security and prosperity. While other regions like Brabant and Guelders also developed into important political units, Flanders and Holland represented the pinnacle of this decentralized power structure. They would become the primary drivers of economic and cultural development in the Low Countries, fostering the growth of towns, promoting trade, and patronizing art and architecture. The legacy of their political consolidation, a gradual process of negotiation and conquest, would define the regional identity of the Low Countries for centuries to come, creating a mosaic of autonomous states that resisted assimilation into larger empires. The decentralization of power that followed the Carolingian collapse gave rise to a new political force in the central Netherlands, the Prince-Bishopric of Utrecht. This entity, unlike the secular counties of Flanders and Holland, derived its authority from both its religious role and its territorial holdings. The bishops of Utrecht, having received extensive land grants from Carolingian emperors, were not merely spiritual leaders, but also powerful feudal lords. They commanded armies, administered justice, and controlled vast estates, making them a significant political player in the region. Their authority was, however, a source of constant tension, as it often brought them into conflict with the ambitions of the surrounding secular rulers. These clashes were rooted in the fundamental power dynamics of the medieval era, where the boundaries between spiritual and temporal power were constantly being tested. The bishopric's strategic importance was undeniable. It controlled a large portion of the central Netherlands and held a key position on the major river systems. This made the bishops crucial allies for any monarch seeking to assert control over the Low Countries. Holy Roman emperors, in particular, often favoured the bishops as a counterbalance to the growing power of the Counts of Holland and the Dukes of Brabant. This imperial patronage provided the bishops with both military support and legal charters that reinforced their authority. However, this reliance on imperial favour also meant that the bishops were frequently embroiled in the political machinations of the wider Holy Roman Empire, diverting their resources and attention from local matters. The conflicts between the Bishop of Utrecht and the Count of Holland were a defining feature of the political landscape. These clashes were driven by competing claims over territory, control of river trade, and jurisdiction over local populations. The Counts of Holland, seeking to expand their influence eastward, frequently challenged the bishop's authority. These conflicts often escalated into open warfare, with castles besieged and lands plundered. The political and military outcomes of these clashes were often decided by alliances with other lords, or by the intervention of the Holy Roman Emperor. The bishopric, therefore, found itself in a precarious position, constantly balancing its spiritual duties with the temporal necessity of defending its territorial interests. This struggle between religious authority and secular ambition would shape the history of the central Netherlands for centuries, contributing to the region's complex web of allegiances and rivalries. The catastrophic and continuous Viking raids of the 9th and 10th centuries had crippled the coastal economy, but the subsequent decline of these incursions allowed a new, more stable economic order to emerge. The shift from a raiding economy, reliant on plunder and tribute, to a trade-based one was a pivotal moment in the history of the Low Countries. This transformation was not immediate, but a gradual process of rebuilding and re-establishing commercial networks that had been shattered during the Viking Age. The re-emergence of safe sea lanes and navigable rivers enabled the development of a long-distance trade. Local merchants, often based in nascent port cities, began to re-establish connections with England, Scandinavia, and the Baltic. They exchanged local products like wool, grain, and butter for luxury goods such as wine, spices, and fine textiles from southern Europe. This maritime trade was a primary engine of urban growth. New settlements, located at strategic points along the coast and major rivers, began to flourish as centres of commerce and craftsmanship. These towns, including Dordrecht, Middelburg, and later Antwerp, were not simply trading posts, but hubs of economic activity where goods were processed, stored, and sold. The development of a monetary economy, facilitated by the increased flow of coins from this trade, replaced the earlier barter systems. This made transactions more efficient and allowed for the accumulation of capital, which was then reinvested in larger ships and more extensive trading ventures. The counts and lords of the region, recognizing the potential for profit, began to actively encourage this trade. They granted special privileges to merchants, built protective harbour facilities, and levied taxes on goods passing through their territories, thereby deriving a significant portion of their revenue from this new economic activity. The re-establishment of these commercial networks across the North Sea was a critical factor in the region's prosperity. English wool, in particular, became a cornerstone of the Flemish and Dutch textile industry, which would grow to dominate European markets. Merchants from the Low Countries ventured far, with their ships and goods reaching as far as the trading centres of the Hanseatic League in the Baltic. This economic dynamism, born from the ashes of the Viking Age, laid the groundwork for the urban and mercantile society that would come to define the Low Countries in the later Middle Ages. The transition from a vulnerable agrarian society to a robust trade-based economy was a fundamental change that would have lasting consequences for the political, social, and cultural development of the region. The fundamental challenge of living in the Low Countries was the constant threat from the sea. The development of large-scale land reclamation was therefore not an option but a necessity for survival. This monumental effort, which would ultimately define the landscape and the very character of the region, began with the rudimentary efforts of early medieval farmers. They initially constructed small, individual mounds known as terps or weirden to elevate their homesteads and settlements above the reach of floodwaters. While these provided localized protection, they did not address the larger issue of reclaiming and securing new land for agriculture. The need for a more systematic and communal approach became apparent as populations grew and the demand for arable land increased. The true beginning of organized land reclamation lay in the development of early dike systems. These initial dikes were not the massive stone and clay barriers of later periods, but rather simple earthworks constructed by local communities to enclose a small area of land. The construction process was collaborative, with each family contributing labor to build and maintain the dikes that protected their fields and homes. These earthworks, often reinforced with timber, allowed for the creation of the first polders. A polder is a low-lying tract of land that has been enclosed by dikes and from which water has been drained, a concept that would revolutionize the geography of the Netherlands. The creation of these early polders was a painstaking process that required an intimate understanding of tides, river flows, and the composition of the local soil. Farmers would work collectively to dig drainage ditches and construct small dikes to prevent salt water from inundating their fields. This initial land reclamation was primarily a local, decentralized effort, with different communities working independently to protect and expand their own territories. It was not yet the large-scale, coordinated endeavor of the later Middle Ages, but it laid the groundwork for the more sophisticated water management systems that would follow. The success of these early dikes and polders led to a slow but steady expansion of agricultural land, which in turn supported a growing population and contributed to the region's economic stability. The technological knowledge and communal organization required for this constant struggle against the sea would become a defining feature of the Low Countries' society and culture. Following the division of the Carolingian Empire, the Low Countries found themselves nominally part of the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that aspired to universal dominion, but often struggled to exert direct control over its far-flung territories. This formal inclusion was more a matter of legal and ideological allegiance than of practical governance. The relationship between the Holy Roman Emperor and the local counts, dukes, and bishops was consistently complex and tenuous. The emperors, viewing themselves as the successors to the Roman and Carolingian traditions, demanded fealty and military service from their vassals. In return, they confirmed titles and provided charters that legitimized the authority of local rulers. This arrangement, however, was a constant source of friction. The emperors were frequently preoccupied with conflicts in Italy or Germany, which prevented them from consistently enforcing their will in the Low Countries. This imperial distance allowed local powers to consolidate their authority and act with a high degree of autonomy. The power of a local count or bishop was often in inverse proportion to the emperor's ability to intervene. When a strong emperor was on the throne, local rulers might be compelled to fulfill their feudal obligations, such as providing troops for imperial campaigns. When the emperor was weak or distracted, the counts and bishops were free to pursue their own agendas, expanding their territories, waging war on their neighbors, and granting rights to towns without imperial approval. The investiture controversy, which pitted the Holy Roman Emperors against the papacy, was a particularly significant event for the Low Countries. As emperors and popes vied for control over ecclesiastical appointments, the region's powerful bishops found themselves at the center of a geopolitical struggle. This conflict often gave them a degree of independence from both imperial and papal authority, as they could play one side against the other to secure their own positions. The Counts of Holland and Flanders, in particular, became adept at navigating this political landscape. They would pay lip service to the emperor's authority, while simultaneously consolidating power and expanding their own influence. They used strategic marriages and military campaigns to build a powerful regional presence, often in defiance of imperial interests. The emperors, for their part, often lacked the resources or the political will to directly challenge these powerful vassals. This created a political reality where the Low Countries were a mosaic of semi-autonomous territories, each with its own interests and ambitions. The Holy Roman Empire provided a legal framework and a sense of shared identity, but it did not provide a strong centralized government. This complex and fragmented political structure would define the medieval period in the Netherlands, setting the stage for centuries of internal conflict and political maneuvering. The political fragmentation and constant threats from both Viking raiders and internal rivals necessitated a new system for military and social organization. This system, which would come to define the political landscape of the Low Countries, was feudalism. At its core, feudalism was a contractual relationship based on the exchange of land for military service. The great lords, counts, and bishops lacked the resources to field standing armies, so they granted portions of their territory, known as fiefs, to lesser nobles or vassals. In return, the vassals swore an oath of fealty, pledging to provide a specified number of armed knights for a set period each year. This arrangement created a hierarchical military structure. At the bottom of this martial hierarchy was the knight, a highly trained warrior who fought on horseback and whose expensive armor and weapons made him the dominant force on the battlefield. The knight's position in society was defined by his role in this military system. He was bound by honor and obligation to serve his lord. Knights were central to both offensive campaigns and, more importantly, defensive actions. The physical symbol of this new order was the castle. Early castles were simple motte and bailey structures, a wooden keep on an earthen mound surrounded by a palisade. These fortifications, while rudimentary, provided a secure base from which a lord could control his lands and protect the surrounding populace. Over time, these castles evolved into the more complex stone fortresses of the High Middle Ages, which were virtually impregnable to all but the most sophisticated siege techniques. The proliferation of castles across the landscape reflected the decentralized nature of power. Each lord required a fortified residence to protect his interests, leading to a patchwork of independent strongholds. The system of vassalage was a complex web of loyalty and obligation. A vassal might hold land from several different lords, creating conflicting allegiances that were a frequent cause of internal conflict. This fragmentation of authority was a defining feature of the Low Countries. It fostered a localist culture where power was held not by a distant emperor, but by the lord who controlled the local castle and could field a force of knights. This political reality, rooted in the military necessities of the age, laid the foundation for a society where local autonomy and self-interest were paramount. The participation of Dutch and Flemish knights in the Crusades was a significant event that transcended religious motivation, creating profound economic, military, and cultural impacts on the Low Countries. The call to reclaim the Holy Land, issued by Pope Urban II in 1095, found a receptive audience among the warrior aristocracy of the region. For these feudal lords and their knights, the Crusades offered an opportunity for both religious piety and material gain. It was a chance to atone for their sins and achieve spiritual salvation, while also seeking new lands, wealth, and prestige. The initial wave of crusaders from the Low Countries joined the First Crusade, with prominent figures from Flanders and Holland leading their own contingents. These campaigns, while physically and financially taxing, connected the local aristocracy to the wider military and political landscape of Europe and the Near East. The economic impact of these campaigns was particularly noteworthy. The costs associated with outfitting a knight and his retinue were immense, often requiring lords to sell or mortgage their lands and possessions to finance their journey. This, in turn, created opportunities for the burgeoning merchant class in the towns to acquire land and increase their political influence. However, the Crusades also opened up new trade routes. Returning crusaders brought back not only tales of distant lands, but also new goods and commodities, such as spices, silks, and luxury items. This influx of foreign goods stimulated the local economy and further integrated the Netherlands into the global trade network. Militarily, the Crusades had a lasting effect on local traditions. The Low Countries knights, primarily accustomed to small-scale skirmishes and castle sieges, were introduced to new forms of warfare, including large-scale battles in open terrain and sophisticated siege techniques used against the fortified cities of the Levant. They learned to adapt their tactics to the harsh desert environment and encountered new military technologies, such as the crossbow, which would eventually become a standard part of European warfare. Culturally, the Crusades broadened the horizons of the Dutch and Flemish nobility. Their encounters with Byzantine and Islamic civilizations challenged their insular worldview, introducing them to new ideas in science, art, and architecture. This cultural exchange, though often indirect, contributed to the intellectual and artistic ferment of the High Middle Ages. The establishment of Crusader states also created a permanent connection between the Low Countries and the Near East, with a steady flow of pilgrims, merchants, and military men travelling back and forth. This movement of people and ideas helped to solidify the region's place within the broader Christian world, reinforcing a shared sense of purpose and identity. The Crusades, therefore, were not merely a footnote in the history of the Low Countries, but a crucible that helped to shape its economic structure, military traditions, and cultural outlook for centuries to come. The 12th and 13th centuries witnessed a demographic and economic transformation in the Low Countries, characterized by the rapid expansion of urban centers. This urbanization was not a random phenomenon, but a direct consequence of a confluence of factors, primarily the revival of long-distance trade and significant advances in craft production. Cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Dordrecht grew from modest settlements into bustling commercial hubs, drawing in new populations and reshaping the social and economic landscape. The foundation of this urban boom was the burgeoning textile industry, particularly in Flanders. The Flemish towns became the epicenter of high-quality wool cloth production. Raw wool, primarily from England, was imported and transformed by skilled artisans into a finished product highly sought after across Europe. The process, from spinning and weaving to fulling and dyeing, was highly specialized and organized into powerful guilds. These guilds controlled production standards, regulated trade, and provided a framework for the artisans who flocked to the towns seeking work. The economic prosperity generated by this industry attracted not only laborers, but also merchants and financiers who established complex trade networks that connected the Low Countries to the Baltic, the Mediterranean, and beyond. This economic activity created a demand for both labor and a market for agricultural goods, stimulating a population boom. A growing number of people left the countryside, where feudal life offered limited opportunities, for the promise of work and a better life in the towns. This rural to urban migration was a defining characteristic of the period. The towns, in turn, developed sophisticated infrastructure to support this growth. New canals and waterways were dug to facilitate transport, and elaborate market squares became the centers of commercial exchange. The demographic expansion was both a cause and a consequence of the economic vitality of the urban centers. The legal and political structures of these towns evolved to reflect their newfound importance. Seeking to free themselves from the direct control of feudal lords, town leaders negotiated for and purchased city rights or charters. These documents granted a degree of self-governance, including the right to establish their own laws, collect taxes, and form militias. The acquisition of these rights marked a fundamental shift in power from the feudal aristocracy to the urban bourgeoisie. This new class, comprised of wealthy merchants and guildmasters, became a potent political force, often clashing with the counts and dukes who sought to maintain control. The rise of these self-governing urban entities created a complex political system that would define the Low Countries for centuries, a network of powerful and fiercely independent city-states nestled within the larger feudal territories. The economic boom of the 11th and 12th centuries fueled the rise of a new and influential social class, the urban merchants. Unlike the feudal aristocracy, whose power was derived from land ownership, the merchants' influence was based on liquid wealth accumulated through trade and commerce. As towns grew, this merchant class organized itself, forming powerful associations and guilds that controlled and regulated economic activity. These groups sought to protect their interests and ensure a stable environment for their commercial enterprises, which often put them in direct opposition to the traditional feudal lords who still held ultimate legal and political authority. The struggle for power between the urban bourgeoisie and the landed nobility became a defining conflict of the period. This conflict was primarily waged through a series of negotiations for formal legal documents known as city rights or charters. These documents were not simply permissions. They were contracts that a lord granted to a town in exchange for money or loyalty. The terms of these charters varied, but they typically granted the town's citizens specific rights and freedoms, such as the right to govern themselves through an elected council, the freedom to conduct trade without excessive tolls, and protection from arbitrary feudal law. The acquisition of these rights marked a fundamental shift in political authority, decentralizing power from the feudal court to the urban council. The self-governing urban councils that emerged from these charters were a radical departure from the hierarchical feudal system. Comprised of wealthy merchants and guildmasters, these councils, often called magistracies or sheepenen, were responsible for administering justice, collecting taxes, organizing militias, and managing the town's infrastructure, from market squares to waterways. The authority of these councils was not absolute, and was frequently challenged by the counts and dukes who sought to retain their influence. This led to a series of rebellions and conflicts, as the lords attempted to revoke the charters and reassert their control, while the towns defended their hard-won freedoms. The fierce independence and political sophistication of these city-states created a complex and dynamic political system. This network of powerful, self-governing entities, fiercely loyal to their own interests, laid the groundwork for the unique political landscape of the Netherlands in the centuries to come. The textile industry was the engine of medieval Flanders' economic prosperity, and at the heart of this industry lay the wool trade. This was a complex and highly organized system that connected the pastoral landscapes of England with the bustling workshops of Flemish cities. The relationship was symbiotic, but often fraught with tension, as both sides sought to maximize their profits and control the supply chain. English monasteries and large landowners, particularly in East Anglia and the Cotswolds, produced some of the highest quality wool in Europe. This wool was not processed in England, but was instead exported raw to the continent. The raw wool was a crucial commodity, and its consistent supply was essential for the survival of the Flemish textile centres. Flemish cloth producers, primarily organised into powerful guilds, relied on this uninterrupted flow of English wool. Cities like Ghent, Bruges and Ypres built their economies on the transformation of this raw material into highly sought-after finished cloth. The production process was a marvel of medieval specialization. Spinners, weavers, fullers and dyers each had their own guilds, meticulously controlling every stage of production to ensure a consistent high-quality product. This organizational structure not only ensured quality, but also gave the guilds immense political power within the urban councils, allowing them to influence trade policies and municipal law. The flow of this commerce was managed by a third, equally powerful entity, the Hanseatic League. This confederation of German merchant guilds dominated trade across the North and Baltic seas. The Hanseatic merchants controlled the shipping lanes and a network of trading posts, from London to Bergen to Novgorod. For the Flemish towns, the Hanseatic League was both a vital partner and a formidable competitor. They provided the logistical backbone for the wool trade, transporting the raw material from England to the Low Countries, and then distributing the finished Flemish cloth across their vast network. However, the Hanseatic League's influence also created a complex dynamic, as they often sought to monopolize trade and bypass local merchants, leading to numerous conflicts and trade disputes. The intricate web of relationships between English wool suppliers, Flemish cloth producers, and the Hanseatic League was the lifeblood of the Flemish economy. It was a system built on mutual dependence and fierce competition, a testament to the sophisticated commercial environment of the medieval Netherlands. The monastic orders of the medieval period were not only centers of religious devotion, but also engines of economic and technological innovation. In the Low Countries, the Cistercians were particularly influential, transforming the challenging, waterlogged landscape through their meticulous and organized approach to agriculture. Their disciplined lifestyle and commitment to manual labor made them ideal agents of change in a region where land reclamation was a constant necessity. The Cistercians were pioneers in hydraulic engineering, developing sophisticated drainage techniques that enabled them to cultivate vast stretches of previously unusable land. They applied a systematic, methodical approach to the construction of drainage ditches, canals, and sluices, which diverted excess water and made the marshy soil suitable for farming. This was a complex and labor-intensive process, but the long-term vision of the monastic community allowed them to undertake projects on a scale that was impossible for individual landowners. The Cistercian monasteries were also pioneers in large-scale farming management. They operated their estates as highly efficient, self-contained economic units, often using a combination of monastic labor and lay brothers to work the land. The Cistercians were meticulous record keepers, documenting their harvests, livestock, and land use with a precision that was uncommon for the era. This data allowed them to optimize their agricultural practices, from crop rotation to the selective breeding of livestock. The surplus from their monastic estates was then sold in urban markets, making the Cistercians major commercial players in the medieval economy. Their wealth, derived from this systematic management, was reinvested into further land reclamation projects, creating a cycle of growth that had a profound and lasting impact on the geography and economy of the Low Countries. The influence of the monastic orders extended beyond their own estates. Their innovations in land reclamation and agricultural management were widely adopted by local counts and landowners who sought to emulate their success. The monks' technical expertise was often sought out for major public works projects, and their organized approach to labor and resource management provided a new model for secular administration. The monastic houses served as centers of knowledge and technology, preserving and disseminating information about farming techniques, hydraulic engineering, and animal husbandry. They were, in effect, agricultural think tanks, whose contributions to the economic development of the Low Countries were as significant as their spiritual ones. Their lasting legacy is visible in the network of canals and polders that still define the landscape, a testament to the power of organized labor and long-term planning. The construction of dikes and the creation of polders, while initiated by individual landowners and religious orders, eventually necessitated a form of institutional governance that transcended personal property lines. The scale of the undertaking a breach in one section of the dike could spell catastrophe for the entire region, required a shift from ad hoc cooperation to legally mandated collective action. This institutionalization gave rise to the water boards, or waterschappen, a unique form of local governance that predated and often functioned independently of feudal authority. These were not monarchical decrees, but agreements among landowners, formalized into charters that established a framework for compulsory flood protection. Each landowner was assessed for the cost and labor of dike maintenance based on the size and location of their property, a principle known as the dike is where the land island. A specialized official, the dike count dijkgraaf, was appointed to lead the board, supported by a council of heemraden, or water magistrates, who enforced the regulations. This system, born of hydrological necessity, was nonetheless a fertile ground for conflict. Competing interests between landholders were a constant source of friction. Upstream landholders, eager to drain their fields and prevent waterlogging, would often discharge excess water into canals that flowed toward the coast. This practice increased the pressure on the dikes and sluices in the downstream areas, which bore the brunt of the water and were thus at greater risk of flooding. This created frequent and bitter disputes over the permissible rate of discharge and the design of drainage systems, often requiring the intervention of the dike count and the heemraden to mediate. The apportionment of labour and financial contributions also led to regular clashes. Wealthier landholders, whose properties were often in more vulnerable locations, were expected to contribute a larger share of the resources. However, they frequently challenged their assessments, arguing that the system was unfair or that their properties were not as exposed as claimed. Smaller landholders, in turn, complained that the burden was disproportionately heavy on them. The authority of the water boards itself was a subject of contention. As these institutions grew in power and influence, they inevitably came into conflict with secular lords and urban councils, who sought to maintain control over their territories. A count might impose a tax for military campaigns that conflicted with a water board's collection for dike repairs, while a city might build a new harbour that altered water flow and endangered a neighbouring polder. These jurisdictional disputes were often resolved through formal legal proceedings, with the water boards petitioning the count or even the Holy Roman Emperor for recognition of their rights and a clear delineation of their powers. The establishment of these institutions marked a crucial step in the political development of the Low Countries, demonstrating that the shared struggle against the sea could create a unique form of cooperative governance, even amidst persistent and fundamental disagreements. The centuries between the collapse of the Carolingian Empire and the rise of the Burgundian dukes were defined by a persistent and often violent struggle for power between secular and ecclesiastical authorities. In the central Netherlands, this conflict was embodied by the ongoing clashes between the powerful bishopric of Utrecht and the surrounding secular counts. The Bishop of Utrecht was not merely a spiritual leader, but a significant temporal ruler, holding vast tracts of land that were granted to him by the Holy Roman Emperors. This dual role as both a high-ranking cleric and a feudal lord placed the bishopric in direct and frequent conflict with the counts of Holland, Gel, and Flanders, who sought to expand their own territories and influence at the expense of the Church. The Holy Roman Emperors, in turn, often used the bishop as a counterweight to the growing power of these regional counts, a strategy that further fueled the political tension. The struggle was a complex blend of military campaigns and political maneuvering. The Counts of Holland, for instance, were particularly persistent in their attempts to seize control of the valuable lands along the coastal regions held by the Bishop of Utrecht. These were not minor skirmishes, but full-scale military engagements that included sieges of fortified towns and direct confrontations in the field. Simultaneously, the bishops utilized their own considerable resources, raising private armies from their vassals and using their religious authority to excommunicate secular rivals who challenged their rule. This spiritual weapon, while less tangible than a sword, was a powerful tool in a deeply religious society. It could turn a count's own subjects against him, disrupt his alliances, and legitimize the bishop's claim to temporal authority. The conflicts were rarely decisive, with periods of open warfare followed by years of uneasy truces. The power of the bishopric of Utrecht was not solely based on military strength, but on its economic and administrative foundations. As a major landholder, the bishop controlled extensive agricultural resources and trade routes, and his court was a centre of administrative and legal expertise. This sophisticated bureaucracy was often more developed than those of the secular counts, allowing the bishop to manage his territories with a greater degree of efficiency. The ongoing struggle with secular lords, while destructive, also forced both sides to innovate. The counts were compelled to develop more centralized and effective military and financial systems to compete with the bishopric. Similarly, the bishops were forced to rely more on the administrative and legal tools at their disposal to defend their temporal power. The outcome of these clashes was not a clear victory for either side, but a long-term political and military evolution that shaped the fragmented, yet increasingly defined, political landscape of the Low Countries. The proliferation of urban centres and the rise of a powerful merchant class in the Low Countries created a fertile ground for the development of a written vernacular. While Latin remained the language of the church, law, and formal scholarship, the practical needs of daily commerce and administration demanded a more accessible form of communication. The spoken dialects of the Germanic peoples in the region began to be formalized into Middle Dutch, a language distinct from the High German spoken to the east. This process was driven not by royal decree or academic mandate, but by the practical requirements of trade, record-keeping, and social interaction within the burgeoning urban centres. Guilds used Middle Dutch for their regulations and membership rolls, merchants wrote their ledgers in it, and city councils drafted their charters and legal decrees using the language of their citizens. This shift to a written vernacular had a profound impact on the literary landscape. Early Middle Dutch literature was not a product of courtly patronage, but a reflection of the pragmatic concerns of an urban and commercial society. The earliest texts were often legal and administrative, but they were soon followed by works of greater artistic and cultural significance. Heroic epics, drawing on the Germanic oral traditions, were among the first literary forms to emerge. These were not simply transcriptions of older tales, but new works that adapted the stories of legendary heroes to a more contemporary audience. The Epic of Carolinde Elegast, for instance, presented a heroic tale that emphasized loyalty and righteous action, values that resonated with the merchant and artisan classes of the cities. Other heroic poems, like the Roman Van Wolwijn, offered more courtly and romantic narratives, reflecting the influence of French literary traditions. The development of vernacular literature was also closely tied to the religious life of the era. The translation of biblical stories and hagiographies into Middle Dutch made religious texts accessible to a wider audience, moving them beyond the exclusive domain of the clergy. Religious texts, such as the Spiegel der Zonden, Mirror of Sins, provided moral instruction and spiritual guidance in a language the populace could understand. Mystical writings, particularly those from the Beguines and other spiritual movements, also flourished in the vernacular, expressing complex theological concepts in a direct and personal manner. These texts were often copied in scriptoriums attached to monasteries or in private workshops, demonstrating the growing demand for books outside of a purely academic or ecclesiastical context. The emergence of a written Middle Dutch and the subsequent flowering of vernacular literature were crucial steps in the formation of a distinct cultural identity in the Netherlands. The rise of a new class of literate laymen in the urban centres created a demand for knowledge that went beyond the traditional confines of monastic and cathedral school. This intellectual flourishing was driven by pragmatic needs, the legal, administrative, and commercial complexities of urban life required a more educated populace. The medieval Low Countries, lacking a major university of their own until the late 14th century, relied on a network of smaller schools and an active exchange with foreign institutions. Local Latin schools served as the primary educational institutions. These were often attached to churches or supported by city councils, providing an education that, while rooted in classical and religious texts, was also geared toward the practical skills needed for a career in law, administration, or commerce. They taught the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, as well as the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, forming the bedrock of a liberal arts education for the sons of the merchant class. The intellectual life of the period was also enriched by the mobility of scholars and students. It was common for ambitious young men from the Low Countries to travel to renowned universities in Paris, Cologne, or Bologna to further their studies. They returned with new ideas and knowledge, acting as crucial conduits for the transmission of intellectual and legal trends from across Europe. These returning scholars often took up positions in urban councils, where their expertise in Roman law and administrative theory was highly valued. This constant intellectual exchange fostered a culture of humanism, even before the formal start of the Renaissance. Figures like Jan van Ruysbroek, a mystic from Brabant, and Gerard Groot, the founder of the Devotio Moderna movement, represented a powerful current of spiritual and intellectual inquiry that was deeply personal and often challenged traditional church structures. This intellectual ferment was not confined to formal institutions. Private schools flourished, offering more practical instruction in subjects like accounting, foreign languages, and trade law. The rise of a literate urban population also fueled the growth of private libraries. Wealthy merchants and nobles commissioned scribes to copy not only religious texts, but also vernacular literature, histories, and classical works, reflecting a new kind of intellectual curiosity. The demand for books was a direct consequence of the burgeoning intellectual life, and was a key factor in the later adoption of the printing press in the region. The intellectual and educational landscape of the medieval Netherlands was thus a dynamic system, shaped by the needs of an urban society and enriched by the constant flow of ideas from across the continent. The protracted conflict between the English and French monarchies, known as the 100 Years' War, had a profound and often destabilizing impact on the Low Countries. Geographically positioned between the two great powers, the counties of Flanders and Holland were unable to remain neutral. Their strategic location made them crucial allies for both sides, and a theatre for a new kind of warfare that combined military campaigns with economic blockades. The core of this geopolitical struggle centered on the Flemish wool trade, which had been the engine of the region's prosperity for centuries. The Flemish textile industry, centered in cities like Ghent and Bruges, was almost entirely dependent on high-quality English wool. This created a powerful and vulnerable economic dependency that both the English and French were keen to exploit. The English, recognizing this vulnerability, frequently used the threat of an embargo on wool exports as a diplomatic weapon against the Count of Flanders and his French-leaning allies. When Edward III of England halted wool shipments in 1337, the economic consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Thousands of weavers and cloth workers were thrown out of work, and the urban centres of Flanders were brought to the brink of collapse. This economic coercion proved far more effective than military action in forcing the Flemish cities to align with the English cause. The threat of financial ruin often superseded the political loyalties of the counts, leading to a complex series of alliances and betrayals that shifted throughout the conflict. The economic consequences of the war went far beyond the wool trade. The frequent military campaigns on Flemish soil disrupted agricultural production and rural life, and the constant threat of invasion led to a militarization of the cities. Fortifications were strengthened, and urban militias became a permanent feature of the social landscape. The war also spurred the development of new trade routes and economic partnerships. When English wool was unavailable, Flemish merchants sought out new suppliers in Spain and other parts of Europe, a shift that had long-term effects on the structure of their commercial networks. The war also contributed to the decline of some older, established cities like Bruges, as the disruptions of trade and the shifting geopolitical landscape favoured new centres like Antwerp, which were less dependent on the traditional English wool supply. The war thus acted as a powerful catalyst for both economic crisis and innovation, fundamentally reshaping the commercial and political future of the Low Countries. The late medieval period witnessed a fundamental geopolitical shift in the Low Countries, as the fragmented territories came under the systematic control of a new dynasty, the Dukes of Burgundy. This process of consolidation was driven by a deliberate and often ruthless policy of territorial expansion, employing a combination of strategic marriage alliances, dynastic inheritance, and military force. The Burgundian dukes, who were a cadet branch of the French royal house of Valois, harboured ambitions of creating a powerful state that would bridge the gap between France and the Holy Roman Empire, with the Low Countries at its economic heart. Their success was predicated on the political and economic vulnerabilities of the region's existing feudal entities. The initial step in this territorial aggregation was taken by Philip the Bold, the first Valois Duke of Burgundy. His marriage in 1369 to Margaret, the heiress of Flanders, a union arranged by the French crown, was a pivotal moment. This single dynastic event brought the wealthy and urbanized territories of the County of Flanders and the Duchy of Brabant into the Burgundian fold. While initially acting as a junior partner to France, this acquisition gave the Dukes of Burgundy the necessary economic leverage to pursue a more independent and expansionist foreign policy. The immense wealth generated by the Flemish textile industry, previously a source of conflict, now fueled the Burgundian state-building project. Philip the Good continued and perfected this process of unification with remarkable effectiveness. He systematically acquired the remaining major territories of the Low Countries. In 1421, he inherited the County of Namur. Through a combination of inheritance and legal manoeuvring, he secured the rights to the County of Holland, Hainaut and Zeeland in 1433, following the death of their last ruler, Jacqueline of Bavaria. This was not a simple legal transfer. It required the Duke to militarily suppress resistance and consolidate his authority. The conflicts known as the Hook and Cod Wars were ultimately resolved by his intervention, leading to the capitulation of the factions and his formal recognition as Count. He further expanded his domain by purchasing the Duchy of Luxembourg in 1443. This series of acquisitions, meticulously executed over decades, created a contiguous and unified political entity where once a patchwork of independent feudal lordships had existed. The consolidation of these territories under a single ruler represented the end of the medieval feudal fragmentation and the beginning of a new, centralized political order. The rapid territorial expansion of the Burgundian dukes necessitated a profound overhaul of the administrative and governmental structures in the Low Countries. The dukes sought to replace the patchwork of local feudal jurisdictions with a centralized bureaucracy that would ensure their authority over a diverse array of provinces, cities, and lordships. This process began with the establishment of a central court in Brussels, which became the administrative heart of the Burgundian state. From here, the dukes appointed their own officials, bypassing the local counts and bishops, to manage justice, finances, and military affairs. They created specialized councils for different functions, such as the Grand Council, which handled legal and political matters, and the Chamber of Accounts, which oversaw the collection of revenue and the management of ducal lands. These new institutions were staffed by a new class of professional administrators, educated lawyers, and notaries who were loyal to the ducal court rather than to their local provinces. Their appointments were based on merit and skill, a significant departure from the feudal tradition of hereditary offices. To fund their ambitious state-building projects and military campaigns, the Burgundian dukes created a more formalized system of taxation. They moved away from the ad hoc feudal levies and sought to establish regular and predictable sources of income. The dukes imposed new indirect taxes on commerce, such as excises on beer and wine, and introduced direct taxes on land and wealth. While these new taxes were often met with resistance, the dukes' ability to enforce them through their centralized administrative apparatus was unprecedented. This financial power allowed them to create something that had been absent from the Low Countries for centuries: a standing army. The Burgundian military was no longer a temporary force assembled from feudal vassals and city militias. It was a permanent professional force of knights, archers, and mercenaries. This new army, loyal only to the duke, was a crucial tool for suppressing internal rebellions and projecting Burgundian power onto the European stage. The administrative and military reforms of the Burgundian dukes effectively ended the medieval era of feudal fragmentation and laid the groundwork for the modern state. The rapid growth of urban centres in the Low Countries during the late medieval period was inextricably linked to the rise of the urban guilds. These powerful organizations, which were a defining feature of life in cities like Ghent and Bruges, controlled virtually every aspect of a city's economic and social life. A guild was a professional association of craftsmen or merchants who shared a common trade. From brewers to weavers, and from stonemasons to dyers, each profession was organized into its own guild with a strict hierarchy and set of regulations. Guild membership was a prerequisite for practicing a trade within a city's walls, and the guilds jealously guarded this monopoly. They set standards for quality, regulated prices, and determined the wages of their members, effectively acting as powerful economic cartels. The guild's influence extended beyond economic control to a significant political role within the cities. They served as a crucial check on the power of the urban councils and the ruling merchant elite. In many cities, guild masters held seats on the city council and played a direct role in governance, managing public works and administering justice. Their political power was especially prominent in the Flemish cities, where the weavers' guilds and other craft associations became powerful political forces. The guilds provided a means for the working population to have a voice in city politics, and they were often at the forefront of popular uprisings against the city's patrician class. These political conflicts, such as the famous Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302, demonstrated the guild's military and political strength. They were also responsible for organizing the militias that were the primary form of urban defense. Each guild was tasked with providing and equipping its own company of fighting men, who trained regularly and were prepared to defend the city's walls and gates in times of siege. This military role gave them even greater leverage in their dealings with the city's rulers. Guild halls, which served as meeting places and centers for trade, were often some of the most impressive buildings in a city, a testament to the wealth and political power of these organizations. The guilds, therefore, were not just economic associations. They were the engines of urban life, managing craft production, regulating trade, and providing the framework for a new kind of civic identity. The 14th century was a period of unprecedented crisis for the Low Countries, marked by demographic and economic catastrophes that would permanently alter its social fabric. The first major blow was the Great Famine of 1317, triggered by a period of exceptionally cold and wet summers. Crop yields across the region failed for 3 consecutive years. The meticulously maintained agricultural systems, which had supported a dense and growing population, collapsed under the strain of continuous heavy rainfall and a lack of sunlight. The price of grain skyrocketed to a level that made bread inaccessible for the majority of the population. Widespread malnutrition led to a surge in deaths from starvation and disease, and food riots became common in cities and towns. The famine was a stark reminder of the fragile balance between human society and environmental forces, even in one of Europe's most technologically advanced agricultural regions. Just 3 decades later, the Low Countries were struck by the most devastating pandemic in recorded history, the Black Death. Arriving in the region around 1349, the plague swept through the densely populated urban centers with a ferocity that defied all medical and administrative responses. The cramped and often unsanitary conditions of the cities, coupled with the constant flow of people and goods through busy seaports, created an ideal environment for the disease to spread. While precise mortality figures are debated, historians estimate that the plague claimed the lives of between 30% and 50% of the population. The immediate social and economic consequences were catastrophic. Labor shortages became acute as the available workforce was decimated, entire villages were abandoned, and agricultural production plummeted. The immense loss of life disrupted traditional feudal relationships, as surviving peasants found themselves in a stronger bargaining position, demanding better wages and conditions from landholders who were desperate for labor. The long-term effects of these crises were profound. The labor shortages led to a significant increase in wages and a gradual improvement in the living standards of the surviving working population. Social structures became more fluid, as the old feudal hierarchies were challenged by a new economic reality. The crises of the 14th century, therefore, did not merely cause suffering. They were catalysts for a fundamental restructuring of the region's economy and social order. The County of Holland in the mid-14th century was not a unified political entity, but a complex mosaic of competing interests. This inherent instability erupted into a series of protracted civil conflicts known as the Hook and Cod Wars, which spanned more than a century from 1350 to 1490. The origins of these wars were rooted in the power struggle that followed the death of Count William IV of Holland in 1345, who left no direct heir. This dynastic crisis provided an opportunity for the simmering tensions between the two primary factions in the county to boil over into open warfare. The Cod faction was composed primarily of the urban merchant class and the more progressive elements of the nobility. They supported the claims of William of Bavaria, who through his marriage to Margaret of Holland held a hereditary claim to the countship. The Cods favoured a strong central authority that could protect their trade interests and provide a stable environment for commerce. They believed that a powerful count was the best guarantor of urban rights and economic prosperity. In opposition, the Hook faction represented the more traditional aristocracy and the conservative landed nobility. This group supported Margaret of Holland herself, viewing her as a symbol of the old feudal order. The Hooks sought to maintain their traditional rights and privileges, which they felt were threatened by the growing power of the urban centres and the centralising tendencies of the Bavarian court. The conflict was not merely a dynastic struggle, but a reflection of the profound social and economic changes reshaping the Low Countries. The urban population, fueled by the wealth of their guilds, was increasingly challenging the political dominance of the old nobility. The civil wars were fought on two fronts. The first involved a series of armed conflicts between the aristocratic factions, with key battles and sieges fought over control of castles and strategic towns. The second, and perhaps more significant, front was a series of urban revolts and political maneuvers. The cities, with their well-organized guilds and militias, often held the balance of power. They would align themselves with one faction or the other, based on which side offered the most favorable terms for their commercial and political autonomy. The intermittent warfare had significant consequences for the county of Holland. It weakened the authority of the counts, as they were forced to make concessions to both sides to maintain their support. It also led to a decentralization of military power, with local noblemen and city militias becoming more independent. The conflicts ended only when the Burgundian dukes, through a combination of military intervention and skillful diplomacy, were able to absorb the county and impose a new centralized order. The establishment of the Burgundian court in the Low Countries ushered in a period of unprecedented artistic and cultural flourishing. The immense wealth and political stability provided by the Dukes of Burgundy, particularly Philip the Good and his successors, created a fertile environment for a new school of painting that would become known as the Flemish Primitives. This era marked a profound shift in artistic patronage and technique. The dukes were not merely passive collectors of art. They were active patrons who commissioned grand works to glorify their court and demonstrate their immense power and piety. This patronage extended beyond the ducal family to the wealthy urban elite of cities like Bruges and Ghent, whose mercantile success fueled the artistic commissions. This economic and political context was the bedrock upon which the artistic innovations of the 15th century were built. The style of the Flemish primitives was defined by a revolutionary approach to realism and an extraordinary attention to detail. Their technical innovation lay in their mastery of oil painting, a medium that allowed for a greater range of colours, richer textures, and a luminous quality that was impossible to achieve with tempera. The most celebrated of these masters was Jan van Eyck, whose work is a testament to this technical brilliance. His ability to render a world with almost microscopic precision, from the individual hairs on a beard to the reflection of a cityscape in a tiny mirror, was groundbreaking. Van Eyck's iconic work, the Ghent altarpiece, exemplifies his fusion of meticulous detail with profound religious symbolism. Every element, from the jewels on a robe to the cracks in the ground, is rendered with a naturalism that was previously unseen. His paintings are not simply windows onto a world, but are themselves meticulously crafted, self-contained universes. Another seminal figure of this period was Rogier van der Weyden, whose art, while sharing the same technical precision as Van Eyck, was distinguished by a powerful emotional intensity. Van der Weyden's compositions often convey a sense of dramatic narrative and pathos, particularly in his religious scenes depicting the Passion of Christ or the Sorrows of the Virgin Mary. His figures are often tall and slender, with expressive faces that convey deep emotional and psychological states. This focus on the human and emotional dimensions of his subjects made his work deeply resonant with both the courtly and urban audiences. Together, these masters and their workshops established a new standard for art in Northern Europe. Their influence radiated outwards, shaping painting traditions in Germany, France, and even Italy. The artistic and cultural achievements of the Burgundian Netherlands were therefore not just a fleeting moment of brilliance, but a defining chapter that set the stage for later developments in European art. The 15th century witnessed a technological revolution in the Low Countries with the introduction of the printing press. This innovation, which had its origins with Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz, found a fertile and receptive environment in the urban centres of the Netherlands. The region's dense network of trading cities, high levels of literacy among the merchant class, and the existing infrastructure of paper production created ideal conditions for the rapid adoption and spread of this new technology. The first printing presses were established in the Low Countries in the 1470s, and within a few decades, printing workshops were operating in cities like Utrecht, Louvain, and Antwerp. This proliferation of presses transformed the process of information dissemination. Books and pamphlets that had previously been laboriously copied by hand could now be produced in large quantities, with greater speed and at a fraction of the cost. This shift democratized access to information, making texts available to a wider audience than ever before. The printing press had a profound impact on the intellectual landscape of the Netherlands. It fueled the growth of literacy beyond the clergy and aristocracy, as more people could afford to own and read books. This created a demand for a wider range of printed materials, including vernacular literature, legal texts, and devotional works. The press became a powerful tool for religious and social reform, allowing new ideas to spread rapidly across the region and beyond. Scholars and humanists, such as Desiderius Erasmus, were able to circulate their writings with unprecedented speed, reaching a broad European audience and contributing to the intellectual ferment of the Northern Renaissance. The printing press also facilitated the rise of a new intellectual class. Printers, booksellers, and editors became integral members of urban society, holding a unique position at the intersection of commerce, culture, and knowledge. They were not merely artisans, but were often intellectuals themselves, curating and shaping the content they published. This new class played a crucial role in the dissemination of learning and the consolidation of a distinct intellectual identity in the Low Countries. The death of Charles the Bold in 1477 plunged the Burgundian Netherlands into a profound political crisis. His sudden demise without a male heir left his young daughter, Mary of Burgundy, to inherit a vast and fragmented territory. Her tenuous position was immediately exploited by both internal and external forces. King Louis XI of France seized the opportunity to invade the Burgundian territories, while the powerful cities and provinces of the Netherlands, long chafing under the Duke's centralizing rule, saw their chance to reclaim lost autonomy. The estates of Flanders, Brabant, and Holland, which represented the collective interests of the nobility, clergy, and urban burghers, came together in a united front. They refused to recognize Mary as their sovereign until she agreed to a series of far-reaching demands. These demands were formalized in a document known as the Great Privilege, a charter that fundamentally redefined the relationship between the central authority and the provinces. Ratified by Mary in February 1477, this document was a landmark moment in the constitutional history of the Netherlands. It dismantled many of the administrative reforms that the Burgundian dukes had spent decades building. The charter stipulated that the provinces could no longer be compelled to meet in a single assembly. Instead, they were to be convened individually, giving each region greater leverage. Furthermore, the Great Privilege granted the provinces the right to raise their own troops and to refuse military service abroad without their explicit consent. This provision was a direct response to the Burgundian policy of using Dutch and Flemish soldiers to fight their wars. The document also enshrined the right of the provinces to refuse taxes or financial contributions unless they were approved by the estates. It mandated that officials, particularly governors and high-ranking administrators, had to be natives of the provinces they governed. This provision was a clear assertion of local identity over Burgundian centralism. The Great Privilege was not a single, unified document, but rather a collection of charters and agreements tailored to the specific demands of each province. The collective effect, however, was a severe curtailment of ducal power and a significant increase in local freedoms. For the first time in over a century, the provinces had successfully asserted their collective will against the sovereign. While Mary was forced to sign the charter under duress, and her successors would attempt to roll back its provisions, the Great Privilege created a powerful legal precedent. It became a foundational text for later assertions of Dutch and Flemish autonomy, representing a powerful and enduring legacy of resistance to centralized authority. The economic geography of the Low Countries underwent a fundamental transformation during the late medieval period. The once dominant trading cities of Flanders, Bruges, and Ghent gradually saw their commercial preeminence wane. This decline was not sudden, but a consequence of several factors that favored the rise of a new economic hub, Antwerp. The physical limitations of Bruges' access to the sea, as its vital waterway, the Zwin, began to silt up, became a critical disadvantage. This natural process hindered the large merchant ships that were increasingly common, making it difficult for Bruges to maintain its status as a major international port. Simultaneously, internal political and social conflicts in Ghent and Bruges, particularly the powerful and protectionist urban guilds, stifled innovation and limited the ability of merchants to adapt to a changing global economy. These guilds, while providing stability, resisted new production methods and the entry of foreign merchants, creating an environment that was less conducive to a burgeoning commercial system. In contrast, Antwerp's location on the Scheldt River provided a deep water port with direct access to the North Sea, accommodating the larger vessels of the era. The city's authorities adopted a far more liberal and open economic policy than their Flemish rivals. Antwerp had no powerful guilds to resist foreign merchants, and its city government actively welcomed traders and financiers from across Europe, including the English, Portuguese, and Germans. This policy transformed Antwerp into a truly international centre of commerce. It became a staple market for English wool and cloth, a key hub for Portuguese spices, and a nexus for German and Hanseatic trade. The city's role in the global economy became so central that it was no longer just a trading centre but a financial powerhouse. The development of new commercial practices and financial institutions underpinned Antwerp's rise. The city became a centre for the bourse, or stock exchange, where merchants could trade goods and financial instruments. This innovation allowed for the sale and purchase of products without their physical presence, facilitating a new level of liquidity and market speculation. Banking and credit services flourished, and the city became a hub for sophisticated financial transactions, including bills of exchange and letters of credit. These instruments reduced the need for physical currency and enabled long-distance trade with greater security and efficiency. The influx of capital and the concentration of financiers, merchants, and brokers made Antwerp the preeminent financial market of the 16th century. The city's economic shift marked the end of the traditional medieval trading system dominated by powerful guilds and a fixed physical market. It ushered in a new era of global capitalism, with an open market, a sophisticated financial system, and a flexible commercial environment. The Burgundian dream of a powerful, unified state in the Low Countries met its abrupt end with the death of Charles the Bold at the Battle of Nancy in 1477. Charles, whose relentless pursuit of territorial expansion had brought him into conflict with both the King of France and the Swiss cantons, fell in a desperate final engagement. His demise was a cataclysmic event for the Burgundian state. As his only heir was his 20-year-old daughter, Mary, her inheritance was immediately challenged. The King of France, Louis XI, saw an opportunity to reclaim territories lost to Burgundy, while the rebellious provinces of the Low Countries sought to reassert their autonomy. Mary, caught between these powerful forces, was in a precarious position. The provinces, in a united front, forced her to sign the Great Privilege, which, as we've discussed, dismantled much of her father's centralized power. To secure her inheritance against French aggression, Mary's advisors arranged a strategic marriage. In 1477, she married Maximilian of Austria, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III. This union was a pivotal moment in European history. It formally brought the vast Burgundian territories, including the Low Countries, into the orbit of the Habsburg dynasty. While the marriage provided a powerful military and political alliance against the French, it also subjected the Netherlands to the ambitions of a new, even more extensive imperial power. The Habsburgs would view the Low Countries not as a native domain, but as a strategically and economically vital inheritance to be defended and, if necessary, exploited. Maximilian, now co-ruler, immediately set about restoring the authority that Mary had been forced to relinquish. He engaged in a protracted military conflict with the French, which ended with the Treaty of Arras in 1482. This treaty, however, did little to settle the internal discontent within the Netherlands. The cities and provinces, protective of their newly won freedoms, resisted Maximilian's centralizing efforts. This resistance, often erupting into open rebellion, was a continuation of the same struggle for autonomy that had defined the relationship between the Burgundian dukes and their subjects. The era of a powerful, locally focused Burgundian rule had given way to the rule of a distant, multinational empire. The Netherlands, now a key component of the vast Habsburg dominions, was set on a new historical trajectory that would ultimately lead to an even greater conflict for its future identity. The stage was set for the Reformation and the Great Wars of the 16th century, defining the final chapter of the medieval Netherlands. The accession of Emperor Charles V in 1515 marked the beginning of direct Habsburg rule over the Netherlands. As the grandson of Maximilian I, Charles inherited an immense collection of territories that included Spain, its colonies, and large parts of Central Europe, in addition to the Low Countries. For the first time, all of the Netherlands was unified under a single central authority, a consolidation that the Burgundian dukes had only ever aspired to. Charles, born in Ghent, had a personal connection to the region and viewed it as the crown jewel of his empire. Its wealth, derived from trade and industry, provided a substantial portion of the imperial tax revenue, a resource he would desperately need to fund his constant wars against France and the Ottoman Empire. Charles's rule brought significant administrative changes, aimed at centralizing power and modernizing governance. He established 3 central councils in Brussels to oversee the provinces: the Council of State, for high-level political affairs, the Privy Council, which managed law and justice, and the Council of Finance, to handle the vast flow of imperial tax revenue. This new bureaucracy, staffed by trained lawyers and administrators, bypassed many of the traditional feudal and urban councils, effectively eroding local autonomy. He also formalized the Estates General, a representative body for all 17 provinces, to serve as a single forum for negotiating taxes and policy. While this appeared to be a concession to local interests, it was in fact a tool to more efficiently extract financial contributions. The religious changes initiated by Charles were equally profound and, ultimately, more destructive. As a devout Catholic and the Holy Roman Emperor, he viewed the rise of Protestantism as a direct threat to both his faith and his political authority. He issued a series of increasingly harsh edicts, beginning in the 1520s, aimed at eradicating heresy. The Placard of 1550, in particular, was one of the most severe anti-heresy laws ever enacted. It outlawed all Protestant books and meetings, and imposed the death penalty for even the mildest offences, such as harbouring a heretic or attending a forbidden sermon. This policy, which led to the burning of a number of prominent reformers, was met with widespread opposition from the local populace, who viewed it as a violation of their ancient rights and freedoms. This religious persecution, combined with the new administrative centralization and heavy taxation, created a deep and lasting resentment that would define the political landscape of the Netherlands for generations to come. The initial spread of Protestant ideas in the Netherlands was not a single, unified event, but a multifaceted process that flowed through a variety of channels. The region's dense urban network, its highly literate population, and its position at the crossroads of European trade routes made it particularly receptive to new theological doctrines. The earliest stirrings of the Reformation were carried by the teachings of Martin Luther, whose writings, printed in German and Latin, found their way into the Low Countries through merchants and students. The initial popularity of Lutheranism was not rooted in a desire for deep theological schism, but in a rejection of the perceived corruption of the Catholic Church. The calls for clerical reform and a return to biblical authority resonated with a populace that was already skeptical of the established religious hierarchy. However, the influence of Lutheranism was ultimately eclipsed by Calvinism, which proved to be a more dynamic and enduring force in the Netherlands. The teachings of John Calvin provided a more structured and organized model for a new church, appealing to the merchant class and artisans in the urban centers. Calvinist theology, with its emphasis on predestination and a moralistic work ethic, aligned well with the values of the burgeoning bourgeoisie. Furthermore, the Calvinist model of a consistory, a council of ministers and elders responsible for local church governance, offered a decentralized, bottom-up structure that was well suited to the independent traditions of Dutch and Flemish cities. This organizational framework was crucial for building a resilient clandestine network of congregations that could withstand imperial persecution. The spread of these new ideas was not a passive process. It was actively facilitated by the printing press, which, as we have previously discussed, allowed for the rapid and widespread dissemination of religious texts and pamphlets. These publications, often printed in secret, included not only biblical translations, but also polemical tracts and sermons that critiqued Catholic doctrine. The movement gained momentum through hedge sermons, large outdoor gatherings where itinerant preachers would deliver sermons to hundreds and sometimes thousands of attendees. These events, held in secret to avoid detection by imperial authorities, became powerful symbols of defiance and solidarity. The combination of an open society, a new religious doctrine that resonated with its urban population, and the technology to spread its message created a fertile ground for the Reformation. These developments would ultimately bring the Netherlands into direct conflict with the Habsburgs' imperial authority, setting the stage for decades of religious and political strife. The proliferation of Protestantism in the Netherlands did not go unnoticed by the Habsburg authorities. Emperor Charles V, as we've noted, was a staunch defender of the Catholic faith and viewed heresy as both a spiritual crime and an act of political treason. He responded to the spread of these new ideas by issuing a series of increasingly severe legal documents known as placards. These imperial edicts were designed to suppress dissent and maintain religious conformity across his vast dominions. The earliest placards, issued in the 1520s, focused on banning Lutheran books and public sermons. These were followed by harsher measures, including the appointment of an inquisitor general and the establishment of ecclesiastical courts to try heretics. However, enforcement was often inconsistent, varying from province to province due to local resistance and the reluctance of officials to carry out the emperor's harsh commands. The most infamous of these edicts was the Placard of 1550. This document consolidated all previous anti-heresy laws into a single comprehensive statute and was intended to be the final word on the matter. It imposed the death penalty for a wide range of religious offences, including printing, selling, or possessing heretical books, attending a Protestant sermon, or even harbouring a Protestant. Men were to be executed by the sword, while women were to be buried alive. Repeat offenders faced the additional punishment of having their property confiscated. This legislation also established a reward system for informants, which encouraged neighbours to spy on one another and sowed mistrust throughout communities. The severity of the placard alienated a broad cross-section of society, not just committed Protestants. Even moderate Catholics were horrified by the punishments and by the violation of local legal traditions, which typically required a trial by a jury of one's peers. The brutal persecution that followed, with Protestants being burned at the stake and executed in public squares, created an atmosphere of deep-seated tension. The authorities' actions, rather than crushing the Reformation, often had the opposite effect. The fortitude of the martyrs inspired others and turned them into symbols of defiance. This public display of imperial cruelty, combined with the new taxes and the centralization of power in Brussels, solidified the opposition to Habsburg rule. The conflict in the Low Countries was no longer simply a religious one. It had become a struggle for local autonomy and political freedom. The religious ferment in the Netherlands produced more than just Lutheran and Calvinist movements. It also gave rise to radical splinter groups, most notably the Anabaptists. Emerging from the radical Reformation, Anabaptism was a distinct and decentralized movement that emphasized adult, or believers, baptism, a direct refutation of infant baptism practiced by both Catholics and mainstream Protestants. Their core beliefs extended beyond a liturgical practice to include the concept of a community of true believers separate from a corrupt secular world. This led many to renounce civic obligations, refuse to swear oaths, and practice communal ownership of property. This rejection of civil authority and private wealth made them a profound threat to the established social and political order, a threat perceived as even greater than that posed by other Reformed faiths. The radical Anabaptists found fertile ground in the Low Countries, where their communal ideals appealed to displaced artisans and the urban poor. Their millenarian prophecies, predicting the imminent return of Christ and the establishment of a new Jerusalem, resonated with a populace weary of war and religious persecution. It was this fervent belief in an impending apocalypse that led a group of Dutch Anabaptists to seize control of the city of Münster in Westphalia in 1534. Under the leadership of figures like Jan Matthys and later John of Leyden, they established a theocratic state. The city became a sanctuary for Anabaptists from across Europe, drawing thousands who believed they were fulfilling a divine destiny. The initial phases of the new state involved the expulsion of all non-believers, the public burning of all books except for the Bible, and the establishment of a communal economy. The reaction of the surrounding Catholic and Lutheran principalities was immediate and unified. The Prince-Bishop of Münster, Francis of Waldeck, organized a joint force to besiege the city. The siege of Münster, which began in 1534, was a long and brutal affair. The Anabaptist regime, under pressure, became increasingly radicalized. John of Leyden proclaimed himself king and introduced polygamy, taking 16 wives. The city's inhabitants endured a state of famine, while the besieged leaders maintained a facade of divine providence. The siege ended in June 1535, when the city fell to a surprise assault. The retribution was swift and merciless. The leaders were tortured and publicly executed, their bodies displayed in iron cages on the tower of St. Lambert's Church as a permanent warning. The violent suppression of the Munster kingdom discredited the entire radical Reformation in the eyes of Europe, pushing the surviving Anabaptist communities towards a more pacifist and non-political stance, a legacy that continues to define groups like the Mennonites to this day. The acquisition of the Netherlands by the Habsburgs brought a fundamental shift in the region's political and administrative landscape, with the courtly life of the Governors-General in Brussels serving as the new axis of power. This city, having already gained prominence as a seat of the Burgundian court, was transformed into the de facto capital of the Low Countries under Emperor Charles V. The governor's residence, the Koudenberg Palace, became the epicenter of imperial authority, where decisions affecting 17 provinces were made and implemented. The establishment of this central court drew an influx of administrators, diplomats, and noblemen from across the empire, all vying for influence and position. This concentration of authority marked a deliberate move away from the decentralized feudal structures of the past. The governance of the Netherlands was placed in the hands of a series of regents, most notably Margaret of Austria and her niece, Mary of Hungary. Both women were formidable administrators who presided over a highly structured court. They governed through three principal advisory councils: the Council of State, which advised on foreign policy and military affairs; the Council of Finance, which managed the vast imperial revenues and expenditures; and the Privy Council, which handled legal and domestic matters. This system centralized decision-making in Brussels, significantly eroding the traditional autonomy of provincial estates and city councils. The local privileges that had been so jealously guarded for centuries were now increasingly subject to imperial oversight and regulation. The court in Brussels was more than just a centre of governance. It was a nexus of economic and cultural power. The presence of the governors-general and their extensive retinues created a demand for luxury goods, financial services, and skilled labour. Wealthy merchants and bankers, seeking favour and lucrative contracts, established residences and businesses in the city. The new administrative centre also attracted scholars, artists, and musicians, fostering a vibrant courtly culture that paralleled the artistic and intellectual developments of the Italian Renaissance. While the economic dynamism of cities like Antwerp was driven by commerce and trade, Brussels' prosperity was increasingly tied to its role as the seat of imperial power. The imposition of new taxes to fund Habsburg wars and a growing bureaucracy was decided upon within the palace walls, and the resistance to these policies was often a direct reaction to the perceived distance and arrogance of the centralized government. This shift, while solidifying Brussels' status as a capital, ultimately exacerbated the tensions between imperial centralization and provincial liberties, setting the stage for future conflicts. The intellectual and cultural landscape of the Netherlands in the 16th century was profoundly shaped by the rise of Northern humanism, a movement that shared the Italian Renaissance's passion for classical learning, but applied it with a distinct and more explicitly Christian focus. Unlike their Italian counterparts, who often sought the wisdom of antiquity for its own sake, Northern humanists aimed to use classical languages and scholarship to purify Christian theology and return to the original sources of their faith. Their motto, ad fontes to the sources, was a call not just to Greek and Roman texts, but primarily to the Bible and the writings of the early church fathers. This intellectual discipline of philological rigor was seen as a tool for religious reform, a way to strip away the accumulated traditions and superstitions that had clouded the original Christian message. The most influential figure of this movement was Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam. A prolific writer and scholar, Erasmus became the intellectual conscience of Europe, corresponding with kings, popes, and reformers. His work was characterized by a biting wit and a deep-seated belief in the power of education to foster piety. He was a champion of what he called the philosophy of Christ, an approach that prioritized inner devotion and ethical living over external ceremonies and rigid dogma. His writings, such as In Praise of Folly, satirized the corruption of the clergy and the abuses of the church, but he was careful to remain within the Catholic fold, advocating for gradual change rather than schism. Erasmus's most significant scholarly contribution was his 1516 edition of the Greek New Testament. For centuries, Christian scholars had relied on the Latin Vulgate, a translation that was over 1,000 years old and contained numerous inaccuracies. By meticulously comparing Greek manuscripts, Erasmus produced a new and more accurate version. His work did not just correct errors, it provided a foundation for the Reformation by giving reformers like Martin Luther the tools to translate the Bible into vernacular languages, allowing ordinary people to read Scripture for themselves. This act of intellectual inquiry had monumental consequences, decentralizing religious authority and empowering individual interpretation. The flourishing of Northern humanism was facilitated by the proliferation of printing presses in cities like Antwerp and Leiden, which rapidly disseminated new ideas across Europe. The intellectual climate it fostered was one of critical questioning and a search for a more authentic spirituality. While Erasmus himself never broke from Rome, his scholarship and his critiques of religious abuses laid the groundwork for the more radical reforms that would soon follow. This movement provided the intellectual framework for the religious tensions that would escalate into open conflict, proving that a philosophical pursuit could become a catalyst for a religious revolution. The era of Habsburg rule began with a monarch who, despite being a native of the Low Countries, would increasingly become a figure of distance and suspicion to his subjects. In 1555, after a long reign that spanned an empire, Emperor Charles V formally abdicated his control over the Netherlands to his son, Philip II of Spain. This transfer was more than a mere change of leadership. It was a fundamental shift in the political and religious orientation of the region. Where Charles V had been seen as a Burgundian prince who understood the local culture and spoke the local languages, Philip II was a Spanish monarch, raised in a court that viewed the Netherlands as a possession of the Spanish crown, not as a collection of semi-autonomous provinces. Philip's reign was defined by two central policies that would profoundly alter the relationship between ruler and ruled: centralization and religious intolerance. He sought to impose a more direct, centralized form of governance from Madrid, undermining the traditional provincial liberties and privileges that had been meticulously preserved for centuries. The advisory councils in Brussels were increasingly bypassed in favor of direct communication with the king's Spanish ministers. This administrative overhaul was designed to bring the Netherlands firmly under the control of the imperial capital, dismantling the decentralized system that had given local nobility and city councils a voice in their own affairs. Hand in hand with his drive for centralization was Philip's unwavering commitment to Catholic orthodoxy. Unlike his father, who had been a pragmatic ruler willing to make political concessions, Philip II was a deeply devout man who viewed heresy as a personal affront to God. He saw it as his sacred duty to eradicate Protestantism from his domains, a resolve that led to an intensification of the Inquisition. The number of bishoprics was increased, and a new ecclesiastical hierarchy was established to more efficiently root out heretical thought. The persecution of Protestants became more systematic and brutal, enforced by a series of decrees and tribunals that bypassed local legal customs. This policy clashed directly with the Dutch humanist tradition of intellectual inquiry and tolerance, which had for decades allowed for a measure of religious diversity. The new king's actions represented a direct assault on the very fabric of society, transforming religious dissent into a political crime punishable by death. The stage was set for a long and bitter conflict, as the Low Countries found themselves caught between the old world of local freedoms and a new era of absolute monarchy and religious conformity. The religious tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of the Low Countries for years finally erupted in the summer of 1566 in a dramatic and widespread event known as the Iconoclastic Fury. This was not a single coordinated rebellion, but a series of spontaneous, localized acts of destruction that swept across the provinces with shocking speed. The catalyst for this outburst was a combination of economic hardship, political disenfranchisement, and the increasingly fervent preaching of Calvinist reformers who condemned the veneration of religious images as idolatry. Unlike the Lutherans, whose reforms were more moderate, the Calvinists held a strict interpretation that saw altarpieces, statues, and stained glass windows as a form of worship that was not sanctioned by the Bible. The first major outbreak occurred on August 10 in the town of Steenvoorde in Flanders, where a small group of Protestants stormed a chapel, smashing statues and defacing altars. From there, the movement spread like wildfire, carried by radical preachers and impoverished labourers. The mobs, often composed of artisans, weavers, and peasants, targeted Catholic churches, cathedrals, and monasteries. They systematically destroyed centuries of religious art, including intricately carved pulpits, precious sculptures, and monumental altarpieces. The sheer scale and speed of the destruction were unprecedented, with hundreds of churches being desecrated in a matter of weeks. The magistrates of many cities, caught between a lack of military force and a fear of escalating the violence, chose to stand by and watch. The political significance of the iconoclastic fury was that it transformed a religious protest into a public act of defiance against the Habsburg regime. The destruction of church property was an attack not only on the Catholic faith, but also on the authority of King Philip II, who was seen as the primary protector of the church. Philip, already committed to eradicating heresy, viewed the events as a direct challenge to his sovereignty. He was furious at the inaction of the local authorities and demanded a swift and brutal response to restore order and punish the perpetrators. The direct consequence of this act was a fundamental change in Habsburg policy. The moderate approach of the regent, Margaret of Parma, was now seen as a failure. Philip II decided that only a direct military solution could restore order. He prepared a massive army under the command of the Duke of Alba, a seasoned Spanish general known for his unwavering loyalty and ruthlessness. Alba's mission was to not only suppress the rebellion, but also to enforce strict adherence to Catholic doctrine and establish a new, centralized order. The iconoclastic fury, which began as a religious act of protest, had become the pivotal event that triggered the full-scale military conflict that would define the next century of Dutch history. The aftermath of the iconoclastic fury created a political chasm between the Habsburg regime and the populace of the Low Countries. To punish the perpetrators and prevent future uprisings, Philip II dispatched his most trusted general, Fernando Álvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alba, with a massive army of Spanish and Italian veterans. Arriving in Brussels in August 1567, Alba's presence immediately signalled a radical shift from the more conciliatory policies of the regent, Margaret of Parma. His mission was twofold: to crush all forms of rebellion and to eliminate heresy. He wasted no time in establishing a new absolute authority that bypassed traditional governance. Alba's most infamous instrument of control was the Council of Troubles, which the populace quickly dubbed the Council of Blood. Established in September 1567, this special tribunal was designed to prosecute all those who had participated in the iconoclastic fury or shown any sympathy for the Protestant cause. Unlike the local courts, which were bound by provincial laws and customs, the council operated under a new, centralized authority that was accountable only to Alba. It was composed of a mix of Spanish and pro-Habsburg Dutch nobles, but its two most influential members were Spanish lawyers, who wielded immense power. The council's procedures were swift and severe, often bypassing due process. Defendants were frequently denied legal representation, and confessions were extracted through torture. The council's actions were systematic and wide-ranging. Its initial focus was on the most prominent figures of the nobility who were suspected of complicity or inaction during the recent disturbances. Two of the most respected nobles, the Counts of Egmont and Horn, were arrested and publicly beheaded in Brussels in 1568, an act that sent shockwaves across the provinces and demonstrated the brutal efficiency of the new regime. Their executions were a stark warning to all who might consider resistance. The council also targeted a vast network of individuals from all walks of life, including merchants, artisans, and ministers. Over the next 6 years, thousands would be tried and executed, and tens of thousands more would be forced into exile. This persecution was not merely about punishment. It was about imposing a new, singular religious identity on a population that had grown accustomed to a certain degree of religious and intellectual freedom. The Duke of Alba's rule, while effective in suppressing overt rebellion in the short term, had the long-term effect of galvanizing opposition. The Council of Blood, by its sheer brutality and disregard for local laws, united many who had been politically moderate or religiously indifferent against the Spanish crown. It transformed a widespread, disorganized religious protest into a coherent political and national struggle for independence. The repression became the primary motivator for a new wave of resistance. moving the conflict from the realm of religious grievance to a full-scale political and military conflict. The arrival of the Duke of Alba and the establishment of the Council of Blood transformed the political landscape of the Low Countries, but it also triggered the beginning of organized resistance. The brutal repression and systematic persecution of Protestants had the unintended consequence of uniting disparate factions against a common enemy. The primary instigator of this new wave of opposition was William of Orange, a powerful nobleman who had fled the Netherlands to avoid Alba's tribunals. As the leader of the House of Orange-Nassau, he was a key figure in the initial resistance, using his wealth and political connections to organize a military and diplomatic campaign from his exile in Germany. His strategy was twofold: to garner international support and to launch military invasions from abroad to stir up an internal rebellion. His early attempts were met with limited success. His land-based invasion in 1568 was swiftly defeated by Alba's seasoned army. The Dutch populace, cowed by the Council of Blood's brutality, was not yet ready to rise in open revolt. Meanwhile, a more unconventional form of resistance was being waged on the seas by a group of exiled rebels and pirates who became known as the Sea Beggars. This motley crew of privateers, nobles, and fishermen were united by their hatred of the Spanish regime and their adherence to the Calvinist faith. Operating from English and German ports, they harassed Spanish shipping and raided coastal towns, acting as a constant thorn in the side of the Spanish crown. Their ranks swelled with thousands of refugees who had fled the repression on land, transforming them into a formidable naval force. The Sea Beggars' actions were driven by a combination of political goals, economic desperation, and religious zeal. They operated with a degree of independence that allowed them to be more daring and unpredictable than William of Orange's land-based forces. Their raids, while small in scale, had a significant psychological impact, demonstrating that Spanish authority could be challenged. The Sea Beggars' activities were not confined to the open water. They played a crucial role in providing a lifeline for the nascent rebellion. They transported funds, supplies, and messengers between William of Orange and the rebels in the Low Countries, creating a crucial communication network that the Duke of Alba's forces could not sever. They were also instrumental in bringing news of the rebellion to a broader audience across Europe, helping to legitimize the Dutch struggle in the eyes of Protestant powers like England. Their very existence was a form of defiance, as they refused to submit to Habsburg authority, choosing a life of stateless rebellion on the water. Their actions laid the groundwork for the more successful phase of the rebellion, as they kept the flame of resistance alive until the opportune moment for a full-scale revolt. The Sea Beggars, a decentralized naval force of exiled rebels and privateers, proved to be an essential component of the Dutch revolt, offering a different and more daring form of resistance against Spanish authority. Operating from a shifting network of ports in England and Germany, they focused their efforts on disrupting Spanish trade and military operations at sea. Their ships, often small and lightly armed, were well suited for the shallow waters of the Dutch coast, giving them a significant tactical advantage over the larger, more cumbersome Spanish galleons. The Sea Beggars targeted Spanish supply convoys, seizing food, weapons, and other crucial resources destined for the Duke of Alba's army. This systematic harassment of Spanish shipping not only inflicted economic damage, but also created logistical challenges for the Habsburg forces, who relied on sea lanes for communication and supply. Their raids extended to coastal towns and villages that remained loyal to the Spanish crown. These attacks were often brutal, serving both as a means of acquiring supplies and as a form of psychological warfare. The Sea Beggars were driven by a fervent Calvinist zeal that saw their actions as a righteous struggle against a tyrannical and idolatrous regime. This religious conviction, combined with their political objective of restoring the rights of the Netherlands, gave their actions a purpose beyond simple piracy. Their ranks were composed of a diverse array of individuals, from impoverished fishermen to disgruntled nobles, all united by their opposition to the Council of Blood. The presence of these exiles in English ports was a source of constant diplomatic tension between Queen Elizabeth I and Philip II, as England secretly supported the rebels while officially maintaining peace with Spain. The Sea Beggars' most significant contribution was their role in keeping the rebellion alive during a period when William of Orange's land campaigns had faltered. They were a visible sign that resistance had not been extinguished, and that a challenge to Spanish authority was still being mounted. Their raids, though often small in scale, provided a constant stream of propaganda for the rebel cause. News of a Spanish ship seized or a coastal fort sacked was a powerful morale boost for the rebels on the mainland, demonstrating the vulnerability of the seemingly invincible Spanish Empire. By disrupting Spanish supply lines and terrorizing Spanish sympathizers, the Sea Beggars effectively created a second front in the conflict. Their actions not only caused material damage, but also sowed fear and uncertainty among the Spanish forces, compelling them to divert resources to coastal defense. Their persistent defiance at sea laid the groundwork for the pivotal event that would soon transform the entire rebellion. On April 1, 1572, the Sea Beggars, a force of approximately 600 rebels under the command of Louis van der Mark, landed at the port of Brielle on the North Sea coast. This event, initially a chance occurrence, would prove to be a pivotal moment in the Dutch revolt. The Sea Beggars had been expelled from their English ports by Queen Elizabeth I, who was under pressure from Philip II. They were seeking a new harbour and had not planned to seize Brielle. Upon their arrival, they discovered the city's Spanish garrison had left to quell a disturbance in a neighbouring town. Seizing the opportunity, Louis's forces issued an ultimatum to the city's small magistracy, demanding their surrender. The mayor and magistrates, with no military force to resist, capitulated. The Sea Beggars occupied the city with minimal resistance, and by the next day they had raised the flag of William of Orange. The capture of Brielle sent shockwaves throughout the Netherlands. Its strategic importance lay not in its size or wealth, but in its symbolic value. It was the first time that a city in the Low Countries had been taken from the Spanish crown and held by rebel forces. The news of Brielle's fall spread rapidly, serving as a powerful catalyst for a wider insurrection. Cities across the northern provinces, including Vlissingen, Enkhuizen and Dordrecht, inspired by the rebels' success and the perceived vulnerability of Spanish power, quickly rose in revolt. These cities, with their strong Calvinist and merchant populations, saw the Sea Beggars' victory as a divine sign and an opportunity to free themselves from the Duke of Alba's oppressive rule. The Sea Beggars, once a disparate group of privateers, were now the vanguard of a full-scale rebellion. The Duke of Alba's response was immediate but ultimately ineffective. He dispatched a force to retake the city. But by then, the rebels had reinforced their position, and the local populace had rallied to their defense. The failed Spanish attempts to recapture Brielle demonstrated that the rebellion was no longer a matter of dispersed guerrilla tactics, but a unified military and political movement. The capture of Brielle also gave William of Orange a tangible victory to build upon. With a secure foothold in the Netherlands, he could now coordinate his military campaigns from within the country, rather than from exile. This victory transformed the Sea Beggars' struggle from one of survival into a coherent campaign of liberation. It gave the Dutch rebels a new strategic direction and a symbol of hope that would sustain their fight for independence for decades to come. Following the capture of Brielle, the Dutch revolt entered a new phase of open conflict. The rebels, led by William of Orange, quickly moved to secure other strategic cities in the northern provinces. Their primary military strategy was centered on a series of sieges designed to wrest control from Spanish garrisons. The initial campaigns were brutal and characterized by extreme violence on both sides. The Spanish response, commanded by the Duke of Alba, was a systematic effort to crush the rebellion through military superiority and a policy of terror. Alba's forces laid siege to cities that had declared for the rebels, with the stated goal of making an example of them to prevent future insurrections. These sieges became symbols of the bitter conflict, with both sides employing tactics that demonstrated a complete disregard for civilian life. The Siege of Haarlem in late 1572 became a defining event of the early war. The city's inhabitants, emboldened by their defiance of Spanish authority, put up a fierce resistance that lasted for 7 months. The Spanish forces, led by Alba's son, Federico Alvarez de Toledo, employed sophisticated siege techniques, including mining and artillery bombardment, to breach the city's defences. The defenders, in turn, used innovative counter-tactics, such as digging tunnels to collapse the Spanish mines and even pouring boiling tar on the attackers. The brutality of the siege was evident in the widespread famine and disease that afflicted the city's population. When Haarlem finally capitulated in July 1573, Alba's forces carried out a mass execution of the garrison and a significant portion of the city's leadership as a warning to other rebellious cities. Another pivotal engagement was the siege of Alkmaar later in 1573. Unlike Haarlem, Alkmaar successfully resisted the Spanish assault, marking the first major victory for the Dutch rebels. The city's defenders, a mix of armed citizens and professional soldiers, employed a desperate but effective strategy. They deliberately breached the dikes and flooded the surrounding land, making it impossible for the Spanish army to continue their siege. The rising water levels forced the Duke of Alba's forces to retreat, their artillery and heavy equipment bogged down in the muddy landscape. This victory, celebrated as the Miracle of Alkmaar, demonstrated the effectiveness of using the local environment as a defensive weapon. It also provided a much-needed morale boost for the rebels and convinced other northern cities that resistance was possible. These early campaigns, both the failures and the successes, established the patterns of warfare and resistance that would characterize the Dutch revolt for the next several decades. The initial military successes of the Dutch rebels, particularly the victory at Alkmaar, were crucial in convincing the northern provinces that a unified front was not only possible but necessary. The fragmented nature of the rebellion, with each city and province fighting its own war against Spanish forces, was a significant strategic weakness. Recognizing this, leaders like William of Orange began to push for a more formal political union that could coordinate military, financial, and diplomatic efforts. The key document in this process was the Union of Utrecht, signed in January 1579. This treaty was a direct response to the formation of the pro-Spanish Union of Arras in the southern provinces, which had reconciled with Philip II and maintained Catholicism as the state religion. The Union of Utrecht brought together the provinces of Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Gelre, and Groningen, along with several key cities in Flanders and Brabant. The Union of Utrecht was more than a simple military alliance. It was a foundational political document that established a nascent confederation. Its primary purpose was to formalize the rebellion and provide a unified administrative framework for the northern provinces. The treaty stipulated that the provinces would maintain a perpetual union, with decisions on matters of war, peace, and taxation to be made jointly. Each province retained its own laws, customs, and religious freedoms, reflecting the deep-seated localism that had long characterized the Low Countries. This decentralized structure was a deliberate choice, as the provinces were wary of replacing one form of centralized authority, that of the Spanish king, with another. The Union's Central Council, composed of representatives from each province, had limited powers, with a strict requirement for unanimity on most major issues. Economically, the Union of Utrecht provided for the creation of a common defense fund, with each province contributing based on its wealth. This consolidated financial power was essential for sustaining the military campaign against the well-funded Spanish army. The document also laid the groundwork for a unified foreign policy, allowing the provinces to present a single front in their diplomatic negotiations with other European powers. The Union, while initially intended as a provisional wartime measure, gradually evolved into the permanent governmental structure of the new Dutch state. By establishing a unified, albeit decentralized political body, the Union of Utrecht transformed the Dutch revolt from a series of local insurrections into a coordinated struggle for political independence. It was a crucial step that provided the legal and political legitimacy for a nation that would soon emerge from the chaos of war.